My name is Claire Mitchell. I am 32, and I used to believe Christmas was about family warmth and traditions. But after losing my husband Ethan in a sudden accident 6 months ago, the holiday turned into something else entirely. On Christmas Eve, instead of comfort, I received a call from my in-laws summoning me to their home in Evanston to discuss his inheritance. I thought it would be painful but simple. I was wrong. Because before I even reached their house, a stranger appeared out of the shadows of a parking garage and warned me not to open my own car door. Why would a homeless man know my name? And why would he say my sister-in-law was plotting against me? That night I promised myself one thing. Whatever they were hiding, I would uncover it, even if it shattered everything I thought I knew about family. Let me take you back to where it began. So I tried to steady myself in the quiet of my apartment, telling my hands to keep busy while my mind spun with questions. Christmas lights blinked faintly from the buildings across the street, their colors reflecting on the snow, but inside my home the silence felt sharp. I folded the same towels twice, rinsed a clean glass, just to hear the water run, anything to drown out the echo of that warning in the garage. On the mantel, a picture of Ethan and me in Denver caught my eye. His smile felt both close and impossibly far away. I poured hot water into a mug, but even the steam rising from the cup could not warm the chill that had settled in me. The phone lay on the counter, still carrying the weight of Margaret's clipped words. They had not invited me, they had summoned me, and the thought of stepping into that house in Evanston made my stomach twist. I stood before the mirror in my bedroom, fastening the pearl earrings Ethan had given me for my 30th birthday. My auburn hair streaked faintly with copper in the light fell around my shoulders. My face looked older than it had last Christmas. Grief does that. It carves lines you never noticed before. I whispered softly, almost to the reflection itself. I have to do this, Ethan. I have to show up. I have to protect what you left. The drive from my apartment in downtown Chicago to Evanston was supposed to take 30 minutes, but traffic on Christmas Eve had a way of stretching everything. Still, I left early. The cold wind hit me the moment I stepped outside. I clutched my coat tighter, my heels clicking against the pavement as I walked toward the parking garage. My chest tightened as I remembered Margaret's tone. It was not about inviting me to a holiday dinner. It was about control. About reminding me that in their eyes I was always the outsider even after 5 years of marriage to Ethan. They had never said it outright, but I had felt it in the polite smiles and in the way Margaret introduced me as Ethan's wife rather than by my name. I paused near my car, my hand hesitating on the strap of my purse. The air smelled of exhaust and melting snow, and somewhere above me a radio played faint Christmas music from an apartment balcony. My phone buzzed again, a message from Margaret. "Do not be late. We are waiting." I shoved the phone back into my bag. My heart pounded, a mix of anger and fear. This was my husband's legacy. They wanted to divide it without me, but I would not let them. Not tonight, not ever. I took a deep breath, pulled the keys from my purse, and stared at the sleek black sedan Ethan and I had bought together 2 years ago. It felt strange to see my reflection in the glass without him by my side. The sound of hurried footsteps broke the stillness. I turned sharply. A man emerged from behind a concrete pillar, his coat worn thin, his beard, unkempt, eyes sharp despite the lines etched into his face. He raised his hands slightly as if not to frighten me. "Miss, wait." My voice caught in my throat, every instinct telling me to back away, but something in his expression stopped me. Not aggression, not wildness, but urgency. "Please do not open that car door." I froze. "What are you talking about?" He kept his distance, glancing nervously around the garage. "My name is Eddie. I used to work security in this building. I know who you are. You are Claire Mitchell, Ethan's wife." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. How did he know me? He took a breath, his voice low and steady. "I should not even be here, but I need to tell you. Your sister-in-law Vanessa has been meeting with people planning something. You were not supposed to show up tonight." The words sank into me like ice water. My pulse hammered. I shook my head, forcing myself to speak through the fear. "That makes no sense." He looked at me with tired eyes. "I know it sounds crazy, but she has been working with Howard. They want to cut you out to make it look like you are unstable. There is more, but you have to be careful." I stared at him, at the sincerity in his weathered face, the way his voice cracked slightly as he spoke. My first instinct was to run, to lock myself in the car and drive away, but my second instinct was louder. If I did not go, if I let them decide everything without me, Ethan's name would be dragged through mud, and everything he had worked for would slip from my hands. The snow outside glowed faintly in the fluorescent garage light. I tightened my grip on the keys. I whispered more to myself than to him. "I cannot stay away. Not tonight." His jaw tightened. "Then be careful. They are not expecting you to fight back." I nodded, though my legs felt unsteady beneath me. I slid into the driver's seat, hands trembling on the wheel, my breath fogging up the glass. As I pulled out of the garage, I glanced in the mirror. Eddie was still standing there, watching, his figure half hidden in the shadows. The streets toward Evanston were lined with glowing lights, families gathered around windows, children pressing their noses to the glass. My heart clenched. For them tonight was warmth. For me it was the start of a battle I never wanted but could not walk away from. The closer I drove toward the Mitchell house, the heavier the knot in my stomach grew. The familiar roads, the sight of the tall oak trees near their neighborhood, all carried memories of barbecues and family dinners that now felt poisoned. I gripped the wheel tighter, whispering Ethan's name again, as though he could hear me through the falling snow. This Christmas would not be about carols or gifts. It would be about survival. I slowed at the last stoplight before Evanston, the house only a few minutes away, and for a moment I let the red glow wash over me, steadying my breath, preparing for what waited behind those walls. The light turned green, and I pressed the gas, my fingers clenched around the steering wheel so tightly they ached. The snow had started again, light flakes swirling in the air, catching on the windshield like cold sparks. My breath fogged the inside of the car, and I cracked the window for air. The houses grew larger as I neared Evanston, each one dressed in white lights, reindeer figures, glowing wreaths. Families were gathering by fireplaces, wrapping paper, crinkling laughter spilling through warm windows. For them, it was Christmas Eve. For me, it was a summons, a test, and maybe even a trap. The words Eddie had spoken circled in my head. "Vanessa is setting you up." I shook my head as if to chase them away, but they clung like burrs. What if he was telling the truth? He had looked at me with such urgency, not the eyes of a liar. My stomach churned. I turned into the Mitchell neighborhood, the houses sitting on wide lots with oak trees and carefully plowed driveways. Ethan had grown up here, riding his bike to the park, sledding down the hill near the elementary school. He used to tell me that one day he wanted our kids to run through the same yards. The thought made my chest tighten, and I blinked quickly to push the tears back. As I pulled into the long driveway, the Mitchell home rose before me, 2 stories of brick, with white trim candles glowing in the windows, every inch strung with twinkling lights. It looked like a postcard, but to me it felt like the mouth of a cave. I parked slowly, cut the engine, and sat there for a long moment with my hands still on the wheel. My phone buzzed again, another text from Margaret. "We are waiting. Do not keep us waiting." I slipped the phone into my bag and pushed the car door open. The cold hit me like a slap the wind, carrying the faint sound of carolers from a few streets away. My heels crunched on the salted driveway. For a moment I thought of turning back, of calling a cab, of leaving them to tear each other apart without me. But then I thought of Ethan's voice, his laugh, the way he would rest his hand on mine when I got nervous. He would never want me to run. The front door opened before I reached it. Vanessa stood there in a pale cashmere sweater and black slacks, her blonde hair falling in soft waves. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that felt like a knife hidden behind silk. "You came. I thought maybe you would not have the courage." I swallowed hard and walked past her into the house. The warmth inside pressed against me, heavy with the smell of pine and cinnamon. The living room glowed with a tall Christmas tree dripping in gold ornaments. Stockings hung on the mantel, each embroidered with names, including Ethan's, as if nothing had changed. The sight nearly undid me. In the dining room, Margaret sat at the head of the table, in a burgundy dress, her silver hair swept back in a perfect bun. Daniel was near the fireplace, hands shoved in his pockets, his expression tight. And at the far end, sat Howard, his suit crisp, his papers stacked neatly in a leather folder. Margaret's eyes flicked up when she saw me. "Claire, at last." I forced myself to meet her gaze. "Thank you for inviting me." Her lips pressed into a thin line, not quite a smile. "It is Christmas Eve. We should not waste time." I slipped out of my coat and hung it on the back of a chair. My legs trembled slightly, but I locked my knees to steady myself. Vanessa closed the door behind me, then took her place beside her mother, leaning back with her arms crossed, watching me like a hawk. Daniel stepped forward, his voice quiet. "Claire, I am glad you are here." I gave him a small nod. At least his words did not carry daggers. Howard cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. "Before we begin, I want to make clear that tonight is about order. About ensuring Ethan's estate is managed properly." The sound of Ethan's name in his mouth made me want to flinch. Ethan had trusted him, had believed he was a friend to the family. Now his presence felt like part of the machinery already grinding into motion. Margaret tapped the table with her manicured nails. "Sit, Claire." I sat. My hands lay folded in my lap, clenched so tightly I could feel the nails pressing into my palms. My eyes roamed over the table, catching sight of the leather folder in front of Howard. I had a feeling the pages inside already bore a story I would not recognize. Vanessa leaned forward, her voice smooth. "We know this is difficult for you, but it is better to face reality than pretend." I looked at her, keeping my face as still as I could. Reality. That word tasted bitter. Daniel shifted, looking from me to his sister, then to his mother. His discomfort was plain, but he said nothing. Margaret finally broke the silence. "This evening is about deciding how to move forward. Ethan's things, his accounts, his home. It all must be handled carefully. You understand?" I opened my mouth, then closed it again, afraid my voice would tremble. I reached for the glass of water on the table, my fingers brushing the condensation. My throat was dry. The sound of paper shuffling made me glance up. Howard pulled out a stack of documents and laid them flat before him. My pulse quickened. I felt suddenly as though I was back in that garage, Eddie's warning echoing in my head. I forced myself to breathe evenly, to keep my eyes steady. I would not show fear. Not to them. Outside, the wind howled faintly against the window panes, rattling the glass. The tree lights flickered. My heart thudded in my chest as Margaret folded her hands and leaned closer, her eyes fixed on me with a cool weight. "Let us begin." Howard adjusted his glasses and opened the leather folder, the sound of paper against paper sharp in the quiet room. The candles flickered slightly on the table, throwing shadows across the walls. My eyes darted to the Christmas tree in the corner, the gold ornaments swaying gently as if mocking the weight pressing down on me. Margaret sat straight as a rod at the head of the table, her lips pressed into a line, eyes cool and steady. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, her arms folded, her expression carefully composed, though I caught the slightest twitch of a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. Daniel hovered near the fireplace, still standing as though unsure whether to join the table or stay removed from it. Howard began in his practiced voice, slow and deliberate. "Ethan's estate is valued at approximately $2.3 million. This includes the residence here in Evanston, valued at $1.2 million, personal savings accounts totaling around $600,000, and stock investments estimated at $500,000. The words rang in my ears, not because I didn't know the numbers, but because hearing them spoken aloud made everything feel transactional, as if Ethan's entire life could be condensed into neat figures on a page. My throat tightened, and I pressed my hands together in my lap. Margaret nodded, once her expression unreadable. "We are here to ensure that this legacy is managed properly, that it serves the family." Her use of the word family made my skin prickle. I waited for her to include me, but she did not. Vanessa shifted forward now, her tone laced with a softness that was anything but kind. "Claire, you must understand that you are still young. You have your own career, your own path. Ethan wanted to make sure you were cared for, but he also wanted to protect what he worked so hard for." I kept my eyes on her, steady but burning inside. Ethan had never once spoken of excluding me from decisions. We had managed our finances together, discussed every major move as a team. To hear her twist his memory into something that fit her agenda was almost unbearable. Daniel finally moved closer, pulling out a chair but not sitting down. His jaw was tight, his eyes flicking between me and his mother. I wondered what he was thinking, whether he too had been swept into their plan, or whether doubt was gnawing at him. Howard slid a page across the table, the paper crisp and official. "This is a set of amendments made in the final months," he said, his voice calm. "Ethan expressed concern about your stability during this difficult time. He wanted to ensure a trust would be established, with the family managing the assets responsibly." The words stabbed me like cold steel. I picked up the page, my fingers trembling slightly. The signature at the bottom looked like Ethan's, but the ink was dark, too neat, as if traced with intention rather than hurried with familiarity. Margaret watched me, her eyes sharp. "You must not take this personally, Claire. We all know grief can cloud judgment." I swallowed hard. This was not grief. This was an attempt to strip me of everything Ethan and I had built together. Vanessa leaned in again, her voice pitched just loud enough to fill the room. "We only want what is best for you. If you fight us, it will be harder. If you accept, we can all move forward peacefully." I placed the paper back on the table, pushing it slightly toward Howard, my eyes never leaving Vanessa's face. Her confidence unnerved me, as if she knew something I didn't, something waiting to be revealed. Daniel cleared his throat, his voice breaking the tension. "Maybe we should slow down. This is a lot for Claire to process." Margaret shot him a look that could have cut glass. "Do not be foolish, Daniel. This is not about emotions. It is about protecting what Ethan built." I spoke then, my voice low but firm, surprising even myself. Ethan trusted me. He trusted me every day of our marriage. He never once doubted my ability to manage our life together. Vanessa tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. "People change when they are dying, Claire. Sometimes they see things more clearly." My chest burned with fury, but I kept my face as still as I could. The gall of her speaking of Ethan as though she had been the one lying beside him during his final weeks, holding his hand, listening to his breaths grow shallow. Howard shuffled the papers again, sliding another sheet forward. "This outlines the terms of the proposed trust. You would receive a yearly stipend for your living expenses, while the remaining assets would be overseen by the family." A yearly stipend. An allowance, as if I were a child in need of pocket money while they carved up Ethan's legacy behind closed doors. My hands shook as I clasped them together tightly. Daniel stepped forward now, his voice stronger. "Is this really necessary? Claire has always managed her life. She is not reckless." Margaret's eyes blazed. "You are too naive, Daniel. We cannot risk everything." The room grew thick with silence, the only sound the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. I sat there staring at the papers, my pulse echoing in my ears. Eddie's words from the garage slammed back into my mind. "They are planning something. You were not supposed to show up." I forced myself to breathe, to stay steady. If I broke now, if I showed them fear, they would win before the fight even began. I lifted my chin, meeting Margaret's eyes head-on. "I will not be dismissed. This is my husband's estate, my life, my future." Her expression did not flicker, but Vanessa's lips curved, a flash of something triumphant in her eyes, as though this was exactly the reaction she had been waiting for. The air in the room shifted, heavy with unspoken battles, each of us locked in place, waiting for the next move. Howard broke the silence by clearing his throat and adjusting his tie as if the fabric itself could shield him from the tension in the room. He tapped a finger on the folder, then spoke in that same even tone that lawyers used when they wanted to sound reasonable. "The matter before us is straightforward. These amendments provide a clear path. A trust protects the estate from mismanagement, ensures stability, and honors Ethan's wishes." My jaw clenched so tightly I thought my teeth might crack. I remembered Ethan sitting at our kitchen table laughing as he helped me balance our household budget down to the last cent. He never once treated me like I was incapable. Hearing Howard suggest otherwise was like swallowing glass. Vanessa leaned forward, now resting her elbows on the table, her sweater sleeve slipping back to reveal a gleaming gold bracelet. She smiled sweetly, the way people smile at children before they deliver bad news. "Claire, you must see this is in your best interest. Why carry the heavy burden of responsibility alone when we can all share it? I stared at her hands. Perfectly manicured nails painted a deep crimson, tapping lightly on the wood, as if she were already counting money that was not hers. Daniel finally sat down, rubbing the back of his neck. He glanced at me with an uneasy expression, then back at Howard. I do not know. This feels rushed. Margaret's eyes snapped to him hard and sharp. It is not rushed. Ethan wanted security for this family. He wanted us united, not divided. Her words hit me like a stone. United, yet she was slicing me out as if I had never been Ethan's wife, as if my marriage vows counted for nothing. Howard slid another sheet across the table, his finger pressing near the signature line. This document, if signed, will formalize the trust. You will receive a stipend of $40,000 per year for your living expenses. The rest will remain in trust administered by the family. My stomach dropped. An allowance. That was all they thought I deserved. Vanessa's eyes gleamed as she added softly, $40,000 is more than enough for someone in your position. My head jerked up. My position. The word dripped with contempt. I gripped the arms of my chair to keep from shaking. Daniel spoke again, his voice firmer this time. Claire has always worked. She is not irresponsible. Ethan trusted her. Margaret cut him off, her voice slicing through the air. Enough, Daniel. Do not let misplaced sympathy cloud your judgment. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. My pulse thundered in my ears as I looked down at the neat rows of text on the paper before me. Words meant to strip me of power, cloaked in the language of protection. I lifted my head and met Howard's gaze. Ethan never once questioned my ability to manage our lives. I will not accept this. Howard's lips tightened, but before he could speak, Vanessa leaned in closer, her tone almost gentle. Claire, think carefully. Fighting this will only make things worse for you. Her words were smooth, but her eyes told the truth. She wanted me cornered, weakened, forced to accept her terms. I glanced at Daniel. He was staring at the table, torn, his fingers tapping restlessly. He looked like a man caught between loyalty and fear. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed, the deep sound echoing through the room. My chest rose and fell with slow, deliberate breaths. Margaret folded her hands neatly, her voice calm but cold. This is not about taking from you. It is about preserving Ethan's legacy. You should be grateful. We are even offering you stability. I felt my face flush with heat. Grateful. They wanted me to thank them for cutting me out, for turning Ethan's memory into leverage. My voice came out steadier than I expected. If Ethan wanted a trust, he would have told me. He would not have hidden it. Howard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Sometimes men keep their concerns private to spare their wives. I nearly laughed at the audacity of it. Spare me. Ethan had never spared me from the truth. We had been partners in every sense. The paper sat in front of me like a snake waiting for me to touch it. My fingers itched to tear it in half, but I knew that was what they wanted. They wanted me to look unhinged, emotional, unstable. So I sat back instead, folding my hands in my lap, forcing my voice to remain calm. I will not sign. Vanessa exhaled a sharp sound, her composure slipping for just a second. Margaret's expression froze, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the table. Daniel looked up at me then, his eyes searching mine. I thought I saw the faintest flicker of recognition, the tiniest seed of doubt planted in him. Howard gathered the papers slowly, his face unreadable. Very well, we will reconvene after a short break. Margaret returned first, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood as she re-entered the dining room. Her face was calm, but her eyes burned, as if she had been rehearsing her next lines in the hallway mirror. Vanessa followed close behind, her phone in hand, quickly tucking it into her pocket when she saw me watching. Howard brought up the rear, carrying the same folder, his lips pressed thin. Daniel had not moved. He sat hunched at the table, his hands clasped together, his jaw tight. He glanced at me briefly, then dropped his eyes back down. Margaret remained standing at the head of the table. Her voice was smooth, almost gentle, though the steel underneath it was unmistakable. Claire, you must face facts. You are grieving, we understand that, but we cannot ignore the incidents that show you are not in a place to handle such responsibility. I frowned. What incidents? Vanessa leaned forward, her tone soft with practiced concern. Last month you missed a payment on your credit card, did you not? I blinked at her, then let out a short laugh that held no humor. I paid it 2 days late because I was waiting for a transfer. That hardly makes me incompetent. Howard slid another paper toward me. There have been other matters. We have statements from people close to the family noting lapses in your memory, confusion, even agitation. I felt the blood rush to my face as I picked up the document. My eyes scanned over the words and stopped on the neat, unmistakable handwriting that belonged to Vanessa. She had written that I became upset at a grocery store, unable to recall what I had purchased, and accused a family member of trying to take my money. My hands trembled with rage. I looked up at her, my voice steady but low. You wrote this? Vanessa widened her eyes in false surprise. It is what I observed. We are all worried about you. I slammed the paper back onto the table. That never happened. Margaret's voice cut in sharply. Claire, denial will not help you. Ethan saw it too. He confided in us that he feared you were slipping. The room seemed to tilt, the air draining from my lungs. My Ethan, the man who had trusted me with every detail of our life, who had never once doubted me, was now being used against me in this twisted way. Daniel finally spoke, his voice rough. I never saw her like that. She has always been capable. Margaret turned on him instantly. Do not contradict your mother. You were not there every moment. He looked down again, silenced. I forced myself to sit straighter, though my chest felt like it might crack open. You are fabricating lies. Ethan never believed I was unstable. He trusted me more than anyone. Vanessa reached for another paper, sliding it forward with a calmness that chilled me. Then why, Claire, would he sign this request for medical evaluation? I stared down at the sheet, my breath catching. It was a form supposedly from a doctor's office with Ethan's name scrawled at the bottom. My eyes lingered on the signature, on the shape of the letters. It looked like his handwriting, but something about it was off. Too stiff, too carefully drawn. My voice came out tight. Where did you get this? Howard folded his hands. It was provided by Ethan in the weeks before his death. I shook my head violently. Number. He never told me. He would have said something. Margaret's voice was colder now. Perhaps he knew you would react this way. That is why he trusted us instead. The room fell silent. The sound of the clock ticking in the hall filled the space, each second heavier than the last. I pressed my palms against the table to steady myself. If they wanted me to break, they would not see it. Daniel shifted again, his shoulders tense. Maybe we should verify these documents. It does not feel right to move forward without more proof. Margaret's eyes narrowed at him, but he held her gaze this time. Vanessa's patience snapped. Why are you defending her? Do you not see she is spiraling? I turned to her, my voice shaking now, not from fear, but from fury. The only one spiraling here is you. You are forging papers, twisting stories, and dragging Ethan's name through the dirt. Her cheeks flushed red, but she leaned back with that same smug smile. You can scream all you want, Claire, but the evidence speaks for itself. Howard tapped the folder again. These documents will be presented formally if you continue to resist. The trust is not optional. The walls of the house seem to close in on me. I thought of Eddie in the parking garage, his urgent eyes warning me that Vanessa was setting me up. I understood now. This was the trap. I looked at Margaret, then Vanessa, then Howard, and finally at Daniel. My voice was quiet, but every word deliberate. I will not be erased from my own husband's life. The flicker of doubt on Daniel's face grew more pronounced, his jaw tightening. Margaret's lips curled into something like disdain. Vanessa tilted her head, her eyes cold and shining. The tension pressed down like the weight of the snow outside, heavy and suffocating. I sat there, heart pounding, as the battle lines grew sharper with every passing second. Margaret pushed back her chair, rising with an air of finality. Vanessa followed suit, though her eyes never left me, sharp and calculating. Daniel remained seated, staring at the untouched glass of water in front of him. I sat there in the heavy silence, the Christmas lights twinkling behind me, my heart pounding with both fear and defiance. They thought they had me cornered, but they did not know the depth of my resolve. The faint sound of carolers drifted in from outside, muffled through the frosted windows, a strange contrast to the battlefield that this house had become. I reached for my purse, steadying my breath, and waited for whatever would come next. The sudden chime of the doorbell cut through the heavy silence like a crack of thunder. Everyone at the table froze. Margaret's eyes darted toward the hallway, her lips pursed tight while Vanessa's hand instinctively went to her pocket as if she had been caught with something she should not have. Howard adjusted his glasses and frowned. Daniel looked at me, his brow furrowed in confusion, as if he too sensed something was about to shift. Margaret pushed back her chair sharply. Who on earth would come at this hour? She strode toward the foyer, her heels clicking across the wood floor. I heard the door creak open, followed by a low voice that sent a shiver down my spine. "Excuse me, ma'am. I need to speak with Claire Mitchell." It was Eddie. I rose instinctively, my heart hammering in my chest. Vanessa's face drained of color, her composure cracking in an instant. Daniel looked toward the doorway with surprise, while Howard gathered his papers as though he could shield them from whatever was about to unfold. Margaret's voice was sharp and clipped. "This is private family business. You need to leave immediately." Eddie stepped into the room, his worn coat dusted with snow, his presence completely out of place amid the polished mahogany and glittering Christmas tree. He ignored Margaret's protest and met my eyes with a steady gaze. "Claire, I have something you need to see." Vanessa shot up from her chair, her voice rising. "He is a liar. He should not be here. Get him out." Eddie pulled a worn envelope from his jacket. His voice was calm but carried a weight that stilled the room. "I used to work for Howard and Partners. I know what they have been planning with your sister-in-law. And I have proof." The air cracked with tension. Margaret sputtered with outrage. "This is absurd. You are trespassing." But I could not take my eyes off the envelope in Eddie's hands. He stepped forward, laying it on the table between us. Inside are copies of conversations, documents, and recordings, proof that these so-called amendments are nothing but forgeries. Vanessa lunged forward, her hand reaching for the envelope, but Daniel was faster. He snatched it up, his face pale as he clutched it tightly. "Sit down, Vanessa," he said, his voice firm, in a way I had never heard before. She froze, glaring at him, her lips pressed into a thin line. Howard tried to recover his composure, but his voice faltered. "These accusations are baseless. He is a disgruntled former employee." Eddie looked directly at him. "You paid me to look the other way." "I did not. And now, here we are." Daniel slowly opened the envelope, pulling out a stack of papers and a small recording device. He scanned the first page, his eyes widening as he read. His voice cracked. "This says Vanessa met with you, Howard, 2 weeks before Ethan's accident." Vanessa's voice was shrill, now trembling. "That is a lie. He made it up." Eddie's eyes burned with intensity. "The recording will tell you otherwise." I could hardly breathe as Daniel pressed the button on the device. The room filled with static, then with voices. Howard's calm tone came first. "It will look like concern for her mental health. No one will question it." Then Vanessa's unmistakable voice. "Once we have the trust in place, Claire will be nothing more than a dependent. She cannot stop us." The sound of my own name on that recording made me shudder. My knees felt weak, but I forced myself to stand tall. Daniel dropped the device onto the table as if it had burned him. His face was ashen, his eyes darting between Vanessa and Howard. Margaret shook her head furiously, trying to regain control. "This proves nothing. People can manipulate recordings," but her voice lacked conviction. I stepped forward, my voice shaking but louder than I expected. "All this time you tried to paint me as unstable, and now here is the truth." "Ethan trusted me. He always trusted me." Vanessa's mask cracked. Her lips trembled, her eyes darted wildly. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Howard gathered his papers in a frantic motion, his confidence shattered. "We should adjourn. This is not the place." Eddie crossed his arms. "The place is here, and the time is now." The Christmas tree lights flickered, as if the house itself were bearing witness. Snow tapped against the windows, a soft counterpoint to the storm raging inside. Daniel looked at me, his voice low. "Claire, I am sorry. I should have questioned this sooner." I nodded slightly, my throat too tight for words. Vanessa suddenly slammed her hands on the table, her face contorted with fury. None of this matters. You cannot prove it in court. Eddie's voice was steady, almost gentle. Oh, but we can. These are certified copies. Originals are secured elsewhere. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's face was pale, her posture rigid. Howard looked like a man cornered, sweat beading on his forehead. Vanessa's chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. I felt the ground steady beneath me for the first time all night. The lies were cracking, the facade crumbling. Daniel set the papers back on the table carefully, his voice quiet but firm. We need to hear everything, all of it. The air in the room shifted once more, no longer heavy with their control, but with the weight of the truth pressing to be revealed. Eddie motioned for Daniel to hand him another sheet from the envelope. His fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded it, then slid it across the table toward me. My eyes scanned the page and I felt the blood drain from my face. It was a transcript of emails printed in neat black ink, showing exchanges between Vanessa and Howard. My name appeared again and again, each line dripping with lies. Vanessa had written that I had outbursts in public, that I once accused her of stealing from my purse during a family dinner, that Ethan confided he worried I could not balance a checkbook. Every word was fiction carefully crafted to destroy me. Daniel leaned over my shoulder, reading with me. His voice broke the silence. Vanessa, you wrote this. She sat rigid, her eyes darting between the pages and me. I could see her throat tighten as she swallowed. Margaret spoke before Vanessa could answer. Stop this nonsense. Anyone could fabricate emails. This is just more slander. Eddie's gaze locked on Howard. You know they are not fabricated. You were copied on half of them. Howard's hand went to his mouth, his skin pale. He shook his head but said nothing. I pushed the papers toward the center of the table. My voice cracked heavy with anger and betrayal. This is what you were building against me. You wanted to make me look like I had lost my mind. Vanessa finally spoke, her words tumbling out too quickly. You were already falling apart, Claire. Everyone could see it. I just told the truth. I slammed my hand against the table. That is a lie. Ethan trusted me. He trusted me more than he ever trusted you. Her composure broke then. Her cheeks flushed, her voice rising to a near scream. You do not deserve what he left behind. You barely belonged in this family. Daniel shot up from his chair, his voice sharp. Enough, Vanessa. The room erupted in overlapping voices. Margaret snapping at Daniel to sit down, Vanessa accusing me of manipulating Ethan, Howard mumbling about legal procedures, and Eddie trying to steady the storm with facts. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. Finally, I stood, forcing my voice over theirs. If Ethan wanted changes, he would have told me. He would never have done this behind my back. Daniel's face softened. I believe her. His words cut through the noise like a blade. Margaret's expression twisted in shock. Daniel, how dare you? He straightened his shoulders, his voice steady now. Mom, I watched Claire take care of Ethan when he was sick. I saw her handle everything when he could not. If he had doubts, I would have known. Vanessa looked at him with wild disbelief. You are choosing her over your own family. He turned on her, his voice sharp. You forged his name. You schemed with Howard. That is not family. Vanessa's lips trembled, her eyes filling with hot tears. For a moment she looked younger, like the little sister desperate for approval, but the venom in her words returned quickly. We had no choice. Do you know how much debt Michael's business has put us in? Do you know what we were facing? The confession slipped out before she could stop herself. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Daniel stared at her in disbelief. This was about money, about your credit cards and loans. Vanessa buried her face in her hands, then snapped back upright, glaring at me. We could have fixed everything if you had just stepped aside. Her words seared through me. I thought of Ethan again, of how he worked tirelessly saving and planning so that we could live without fear. His love was in every dollar, every decision. And here was his sister ready to tear it apart to cover her mistakes. Eddie placed another document on the table. This one was a receipt, a payment from Vanessa's account to Howard's firm. A large sum withdrawn just weeks after Ethan's funeral. Howard lunged for it, but Daniel blocked him. His voice roared with a strength I had never heard before. This is fraud. The room fell into silence once more, the weight of truth now undeniable. The only sound was the faint whistle of wind outside rattling the window panes. I looked at Margaret expecting denial, but her face was ghostly pale. Her voice wavered as she whispered, "Vanessa, tell me this is not true." Vanessa's tears spilled over her words, tumbling out in desperation. "I did it for us, for the family, for Michael. We were drowning." Her mother stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. Howard finally stood gathering his folder. "This discussion has gone far enough. We should adjourn before any further damage is done." Eddie's voice was firm, steady. "The damage has already been done." I stood there, hands pressed against the edge of the table, my pulse pounding, as the storm quieted. For the first time that night, the lies no longer held the power. The truth was spreading like cracks in glass, impossible to stop. Vanessa sank back into her chair, her chest heaving, her eyes red and wild. Margaret sat frozen, Daniel stood tall, and Eddie remained by my side. The night was far from over, but I could feel the tide turning. Margaret's hand trembled as she reached for her glass of water, the ice clinking against the sides. She took a slow sip, her eyes never leaving Vanessa. The room was still, the tension so thick it pressed against my chest. I could hear the faint hum of the heater kicking on, blending with the wind outside. Daniel broke the silence first, his voice raw with disbelief. "You dragged us into this because of money. Debt you and Michael created. You tried to make Mom complicit in it. And now you want Claire to pay for it with her life." Vanessa's shoulders stiffened. Her mascara had begun to smudge, leaving dark shadows under her eyes. She wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, then snapped, "You do not understand what it feels like to lose everything. We were drowning, Daniel. Every day was another call, another bill. I had to do something." I leaned forward, my voice low but steady. "You chose to forge documents and lie. You chose to smear me instead of asking for help." Vanessa's eyes locked onto mine, fierce and unblinking. "You were never really one of us. Ethan was my brother, and you only had a few years with him. Why should you walk away with everything when we are left with nothing?" My stomach turned, but I forced myself to meet her anger with calm. "Because Ethan chose me. Because we built a life together. Because he trusted me with everything." Daniel exhaled sharply and pushed his chair back. He turned to Margaret, his voice pleading, "Mom, you cannot defend this. Not anymore." Margaret sat stiff and silent, her lips pressed into a hard line. She looked at Vanessa, then at Howard, then at me. Finally, she spoke, her tone flat. This should have been handled differently. Vanessa's mouth dropped open. "You are blaming me now, after everything." Eddie stepped closer to the table, his voice steady as a stone. "What you did was more than desperation. You tried to ruin someone's name, maybe even her life, to cover up your mistakes. That is not family." Howard shifted uneasily, his hand hovering near the folder, as though it could still protect him. He muttered, "We should not be discussing this without counsel." Daniel snapped, "You are counsel, Howard. And you were part of it." The words landed like a blow. Howard's face flushed, his jaw tight. He reached for the papers, but Daniel's hand came down hard over them. "You are not walking out with this." I could feel my pulse in my throat, the gravity of everything crashing into place. Vanessa had admitted too much. Howard was cornered. The walls that had been closing in on me were now closing in on them. Vanessa stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the wood floor. She pointed at me, her hand shaking. "If Ethan were alive, he would never have let you take it all. He would have chosen us." The words sliced deep, but I steadied myself, remembering Ethan's hand in mine, his voice whispering to me in the hospital when he was too weak to raise it. He had told me he wanted me to be strong, that I could handle everything. I clung to that memory like a lifeline. Daniel's voice cut through the moment. "Stop rewriting Ethan's love. He chose Claire. We all saw it. He built everything with her, not you." Vanessa's face twisted, her fury spilling over. "You always took her side. You always ignored me." Daniel shook his head, his eyes wet with anger. "No, Vanessa, I ignored the truth. That is what I did wrong. Eddie reached into the envelope once more and pulled out a final sheet. His tone was calm but unyielding. This one shows the payments made to Howard's firm. Dates, amounts all tied to your accounts, Vanessa. Vanessa lunged forward, trying to snatch it from him, but Daniel blocked her path. His voice roared in the dining room. Enough. Margaret flinched at the sound, her hand pressing to her temple. She whispered almost to herself. This family is tearing itself apart. I spoke quietly but firmly. No, Margaret. It was not me who broke this family. It was the lies. The room fell into silence again, the only sound the faint crackle of the fire in the hearth. Vanessa stood trembling, her chest heaving, her eyes darting like a trapped animal. Howard slumped in his chair, his hands clasped tightly, his gaze on the floor. Daniel stood tall, the papers in his grip. The Christmas lights twinkled in the corner, their glow a cruel reminder of the holiday this night was supposed to be. I folded my hands in my lap, drawing a deep breath. The truth was out, but I knew it was not the end. Not yet. Outside, a siren wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder as it approached. Red and blue lights flashed against the frosted windows, scattering across the polished wood floor and the glittering ornaments on the Christmas tree. Everyone in the room froze, the sound of tires crunching over snow echoing from the driveway. Margaret's hand tightened on her glass so hard I thought it might shatter. Vanessa's breath came fast and shallow, her eyes wide as she darted toward Howard. Daniel was the first to move. He strode to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. His voice was low but certain. It's the police. Vanessa spun toward Margaret, panic breaking through her mask. You called them, didn't you? You betrayed me. Margaret shook her head quickly, her face pale. I did not. Eddie's voice was steady. I did. Every head turned to him. He stood calmly, his coat still dusted with snow, his expression unwavering. I called them before I walked in here. I knew this would not end with words alone. Howard rose abruptly, his papers spilling across the table. This is outrageous. We are not criminals. Eddie's eyes narrowed. The evidence says otherwise. The knock at the door was firm, commanding. Margaret hesitated only a moment before walking slowly toward the foyer. Her steps were heavy, her shoulders hunched as if the years had finally caught up with her. She opened the door, and two officers stepped inside, their dark uniforms stark against the warm glow of the house. Good evening. We received a call about possible fraud and forgery. One officer's gaze swept the room, pausing on Vanessa, then Howard, before settling on the folder of documents scattered across the dining table. Vanessa stammered, her voice high and brittle. This is a family matter. You have no right. The officer shook his head. Fraud is not a family matter. It is a crime. Howard tried to gather himself, his words stumbling. This is a misunderstanding. These documents are confidential. The second officer stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. Then, you will not mind us taking a look. Daniel held the envelope. Eddie had brought his knuckles white as he extended it to the officer. These are copies. The originals are safe elsewhere. The officer accepted them, flipping through quickly, his eyes narrowing as he caught sight of the signatures and the payment records. He glanced at Vanessa. Miss Mitchell, did you authorize these payments to the law firm? Vanessa's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her face crumpled. She turned to Margaret as if for rescue, but her mother looked away, her face drawn and gray. I felt a strange calm settle over me as the truth unfolded. For weeks they had tried to paint me as unstable, unfit, incapable of managing my own life. Now it was their turn to be scrutinized under the harsh light of accountability. Vanessa's voice broke in a desperate cry. I only did it to protect the family. We were drowning in debt. Michael's business was failing. I had no choice. The officer's tone did not soften. You had a choice. You chose forgery. You chose lies. Howard's face was flushed, red sweat shining on his forehead. He raised his hands in protest. I only advised. I did not forge anything myself. Eddie's voice cut through the air like a blade. You facilitated it. You drafted false amendments and took her money to make it happen. The officer nodded slowly. That will be for the investigators to determine. Daniel's shoulders slumped with visible relief. For the first time all night, he looked at me not with guilt or hesitation, but with quiet respect. Margaret sank back into her chair, her hand pressed against her temple. Her voice was faint, almost a whisper. How did it come to this? I wanted to tell her it came to this because she let Vanessa run unchecked, because she had turned a blind eye to her daughter's scheming. But the words caught in my throat. I no longer needed to fight. The evidence was stronger than anything I could say. The officers gathered the folder of documents and the recorder, slipping them into evidence bags. One of them motioned toward Vanessa and Howard. We will need you both to come with us for questioning. Vanessa gasped, her body trembling. No, please. Not tonight. Not Christmas Eve. The officer's face did not change. Crime does not take holidays, Howard muttered under his breath, as he straightened his jacket, his pride deflating with every movement. Vanessa, however, collapsed into her chair, sobbing uncontrollably. Daniel reached for her shoulder, but stopped, his hand hovering in the air before he pulled it back. His face was etched with sorrow, but he did not defend her. Margaret finally lifted her eyes to me. Her gaze was hollow, stripped of the superiority that had once weighed on me. I could not read if it was regret, shame, or both. The officers guided Vanessa and Howard toward the door. Vanessa's cries echoed through the hallway, sharp and bitter. I stood still, my body trembling, but for the first time that night, it was not from fear, it was from release. As the door closed behind them, silence returned. The tree lights flickered, softly casting golden reflections across the table. Daniel sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands. Margaret remained rigid, her expression vacant. Eddie stood beside me, steady and silent. The night was quiet again, but I knew nothing would ever be the same. Daniel lifted his head from his hands, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. He looked at me as though seeing me for the first time, not as the woman his sister despised, but as the person Ethan had chosen. I am sorry, Claire. His voice cracked. I should have protected you instead of sitting silent. I wanted to answer, but my throat felt tight. Words seemed too small for the weight of everything that had just unfolded. Eddie placed a steadying hand on my shoulder, grounding me in that moment. Margaret rose slowly from her chair, her hand resting on the edge of the table for support. She looked years older, her back slightly stooped, her once firm voice reduced to a tremor. The family? She whispered. All of it broken. I turned to her, my tone cool but not cruel. It broke because of choices, Margaret. Not because of me. Her eyes glistened, though no tears fell. She lowered herself back into the chair and said nothing more. The clock in the hall chimed midnight. Christmas Day, a holiday meant for peace, now heavy with ruin. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice low. What happens now? Eddie answered before I could. The investigation will move quickly. With the documents and the recording, they have enough to bring charges. Margaret closed her eyes as though the words pierced her. Daniel rubbed his palms together, his shoulders hunched. I reached for my purse, slipping the strap over my shoulder. My voice was steadier than I expected. Now I go home. I have had enough of this house for one lifetime. No one stopped me as I walked toward the foyer. The hallway lights glowed softly, illuminating the framed photos of Ethan as a boy smiling beside a younger Vanessa and Daniel. I paused at one, studying Ethan's bright eyes. I touched the frame lightly, then let my hand fall away. Daniel followed me to the door. His voice was quiet. Claire, if you ever need anything, I will be there. I nodded once. For Ethan's sake, I hope that is true. The night air hit me as I stepped outside. The snow had stopped, leaving a soft white blanket that shimmered under the streetlights. The police cruiser was gone. Tire tracks etched across the driveway. The silence was deep, broken only by the crunch of my boots as I walked to my car. Eddie was right behind me. You should not be alone tonight. Let me follow you home just to be safe. I hesitated, then nodded. I was too drained to argue. The drive back felt different than the one that had brought me there. I no longer felt the crushing dread, only a hollow ache where fear had once lived. The lights of Evanston twinkled, faintly, houses lined with decorations, families likely gathered around fireplaces with cocoa and laughter. My Christmas Eve had been consumed by betrayal and revelation, but I was still standing. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a moment, staring at the house Ethan and I had shared. The porch light glowed softly, just as it always had when he waited for me to come home. My throat tightened. Eddie parked behind me, stepped out, and stood near the curb. He gave me space but stayed close enough to be present. I finally climbed out of the car, my body heavy with exhaustion. Inside the house was quiet. I hung my coat and set my purse on the counter. For the first time in weeks, the silence did not feel threatening. It felt like my own. I poured a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the faint outline of the Christmas tree in the living room. The ornaments glittered softly in the dark reminders of holidays, when Ethan was still here, when laughter filled these walls. The ache in my chest swelled, but beneath it was something steadier, something like resolve. They had tried to erase me, but the truth was mine. Ethan's love, his trust, his life with me could not be rewritten. I closed my eyes, letting the quiet wrap around me. Tomorrow would bring questions, lawyers, and headlines. But tonight I allowed myself to breathe. Eddie knocked lightly on the door. I opened it, and he gave a small nod. "Just wanted to make sure you were all right." I managed a faint smile. "I am, or at least I will be." He tipped his head, then walked back to his car. I watched the taillights fade down the street before closing the door and turning the lock. In the stillness, I whispered Ethan's name, my hand pressed over my heart. I would not let them take away what we had built. Not tonight, not ever. The tree lights blinked softly, casting a gentle glow across the room, and I sat there until the first hints of dawn began to touch the sky. The sun rose pale and cold over Evanston, the light spilling through the kitchen window in muted shades of gold. I had not slept, but I felt steadier than I had in weeks. My phone sat on the counter, buzzing with missed calls and messages. Most were from numbers I did not recognize, but Daniel's name appeared twice, and Margaret's once. I let them sit unanswered. The kettle whistled softly on the stove as I made tea. The simple act felt grounding, the steam curling around my face. I carried the mug to the living room and sat by the window watching the quiet street. Children were already outside, bundled in puffy coats, dragging sleds over the snow. Their laughter floated up faintly, a reminder that the world had not stopped because mine had been turned upside down. A knock on the door startled me. My pulse jumped until I saw Eddie standing there, his coat zipped up against the morning chill. He gave me a faint smile when I opened the door. "Morning, Claire. I thought you could use some company." I stepped aside and let him in. His presence filled the space with a quiet reassurance. He carried a small paper bag and set it on the counter. "Bagels, fresh. Figured you might not have eaten." I felt my lips curve in something close to a smile. "Thank you. That is thoughtful." We ate in silence for a few minutes, the sound of chewing and the clink of mugs oddly comforting. Finally, Eddie spoke, his voice gentle. "The police will be contacting you soon. They will want a full statement. Are you ready for that?" I nodded slowly. "I am. It will not be easy, but I am not afraid anymore." Eddie leaned back, studying me. "You were stronger last night than most people I have ever seen." I swallowed, hard, emotion rising unexpectedly. I was terrified, Eddie. But I kept thinking about Ethan. He would have hated what they tried to do. I could not let them win. His eyes softened. He would be proud. The room went quiet again, but it was not heavy. For the first time in months, the silence felt like peace instead of a cage. Later that afternoon, Daniel showed up. He stood awkwardly on the porch, his hands shoved into his coat pockets. When I opened the door, his eyes met mine with a mixture of guilt and determination. "I thought you would not answer," he said quietly. I considered closing the door, but something in his face stopped me. I stepped aside and he entered slowly, as if unsure he belonged. Eddie nodded at him but did not leave. Daniel glanced at him before speaking. "I came to tell you, they will face charges. Vanessa and Howard. The police called me this morning. They have more than enough evidence." My chest rose and fell in a deep breath. Relief washed through me, but it was tangled with sorrow. Ethan's sister facing prison. His mother left broken in the wreckage. Daniel rubbed his forehead. Mom is devastated. She refuses to leave the house. She keeps saying Christmas is ruined. A bitter laugh slipped from my lips before I could stop it. Christmas was ruined the moment Vanessa decided money was worth more than family. Daniel flinched, then nodded. You are right. Still, she is my mother. I did not answer. The weight of loyalty and blood was his burden, not mine. He shifted uncomfortably, then looked at me squarely. Claire, I need you to know I did not know the full extent of what Vanessa was doing. I suspected, yes, but I did not stop it. For that I am sorry. I studied him for a long moment. His remorse seemed real, the lines of exhaustion etched deep into his face. Finally I said, You could have stopped her sooner. He lowered his head. I know. Silence stretched between us, filled only by the sound of the clock ticking on the mantel. Then Daniel's voice broke again. I want to make it right. However I can. I shook my head. That is not something you can fix overnight. Trust takes time. Eddie cleared his throat. At least he is here now. That counts for something. Daniel glanced at him with gratitude, then back at me. Please, Claire, let me help. I crossed my arms, my voice firm. If you mean it, then tell the truth when the time comes. Stand by it no matter how ugly it gets. His eyes met mine, steady this time. I will. He left soon after, his shoulders hunched against the cold as he walked down the driveway. I watched him go, a strange mix of anger and hope twisting inside me. That night I sat by the fire, the warmth flickering across the walls. The tree still glowed in the corner, though its beauty felt muted now. I thought of Ethan, of how he would have hated to see his family unravel like this. And yet, I knew he would have wanted me to survive it. The phone rang once more. This time I answered. It was Detective Monroe, her voice professional but kind. Mrs. Mitchell, we would like you to come in tomorrow to give your full statement. I agreed, my voice steady. After hanging up, I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes. Tomorrow would be another step toward justice. Another step toward reclaiming the life they tried to take from me. The house was quiet, the fire warm, and for the first time in a long while, I let myself believe that healing might be possible. The next morning was clear and sharp, the kind of winter day when the air stung your lungs and the sunlight bounced off the snow like glass. I drove to the station with Eddie, following in his car, his quiet presence behind me, a reassurance I had come to depend on. Inside the precinct, Detective Monroe greeted me with a firm handshake and led me to a small office where the blinds were half drawn and the hum of fluorescent lights filled the space. She clicked on a recorder and asked me to begin at the start. I told her everything, my voice steady, as I laid out each piece of the scheme. The forged documents, the false reports about my health, the attempts to push me aside. I explained how Vanessa had cornered me in that house, how Howard had backed her every step of the way, and how Daniel finally found his voice. At times the words caught in my throat, but I pressed on, refusing to let the lies hold power anymore. When I finished, Detective Monroe nodded. Your testimony matches the evidence we have. They will face charges of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. She paused, her expression softening. I know this has not been easy. I exhaled a deep breath that carried weeks of tension. No, it has not. But it was necessary. On the drive home, the world felt different. The snowbanks that had seemed cold and oppressive now looked almost beautiful, glinting in the sun. For the first time since Ethan's passing, I felt like I was moving forward instead of standing still. A week later, Daniel came to my house. He stood on the porch, a bakery box in his hands, his breath visible in the January chill. When I let him in, he set the box on the counter and spoke before I could. They arraigned Vanessa and Howard yesterday. She broke down in court. I studied his face, the grief and shame still etched there. What happens to Margaret? He looked down. She is struggling. She will not forgive Vanessa, but she will not forgive herself either. I poured coffee for both of us, the kitchen filled with the familiar scent. He wrapped his hands around the mug but did not drink. I just want you to know, Claire, I am done hiding. When the trial comes, I will tell the truth, no matter how hard it is. For the first time, I reached across the table and laid my hand over his. Thank you, Daniel. That matters. Eddie joined us a little later, carrying paperwork from the prosecutor's office. He had agreed to testify to stand in court and confirm what he had witnessed at the firm. His loyalty was something I could never have expected when I met him in that parking garage, but it had become one of the strongest truths in my life. By spring, the trial had begun. I sat in the courtroom as Vanessa avoided my eyes, her once confident stride reduced to shuffling steps. Howard looked smaller than I remembered, his arrogance drained by the weight of the charges. Margaret sat in the back, her hands folded in her lap, her face lined with exhaustion. When the verdict came, it was swift. Guilty. Vanessa sobbed openly. Howard's jaw clenched as the judge read the sentence. They would serve time, repay what they had taken, and carry the stain of their crimes for the rest of their lives. I walked out of that courtroom into the bright afternoon sun, Daniel at my side. He did not speak, but the relief in his face said enough. The months that followed were quieter. I focused on my work, my home, and rebuilding the rhythm of my days. Eddie helped with small repairs around the house, and often stayed for dinner, his easy manner filling the silence that once haunted the rooms. Daniel visited more too, sometimes just for coffee, sometimes to help shovel the driveway. Trust was not rebuilt overnight, but piece by piece it began to take shape. On the anniversary of Ethan's passing, I stood in the garden where he used to plant tomatoes, the soil still frozen under the early spring sun. I whispered a promise to him that I had fought for the truth, that I had not let them erase what we built together. Life did not return to what it once was. It never could. But it found a new shape, one that carried both the scars of betrayal and the strength of survival. As I sit here now, months later, the house warm and the garden beginning to bloom again, I know one thing with certainty. They tried to break me, but I am still here. Stronger, wiser, and unwilling to ever be silenced again. And now I want to hear from you. What would you have done in my place? Have you ever faced betrayal within a family, and how did you find your way forward? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if my story kept you with me to the end, consider liking and subscribing so you do not miss the next one. Every story holds a lesson, and I would love to share more with you.